Professor Carafit here, Bio 1440 and 1441 coordinator. I want to talk to you a little bit about your first lab report for Bio 2, Bio 1441, a lab report on microevolution. So just to walk you through this, just in case you have not written a lab report before or you're unsure how to approach this particular report. All reports are going to follow a similar format in your biology courses. They're going to have an introduction, a materials and methods, a result section, and a conclusion or discussion section. You can call it either one usually. But if you look in your manual, just so you know, Appendix B, which starts on page 113, looks something like this if you can see me. And on page 117, there is a rubric, which is basically what we use to grade your report. So we will assess your report to see how well you've accomplished the various tasks listed. And basically, they will be assessed using the criteria listed on here. But to get an A, which is full credit for each of the various sections, to get that A, you want to try to exceed expectations, go above and beyond what is simply listed there. So, microevolution lab report checklist. So, in an introduction, well, let me start here. First, you'll start with a clear and concise title, something that tells the reader what the experiment is about. So don't call it Bean Lab, right? You want to give it a clear title. This is a lab report about natural selection. That is the theme of the report, natural selection and evolution. So you want to make that clear in the title. You should have your name followed by your lab partner's names, and often you might include your instructor's name there as well. So what goes into an introduction? You should have background information. What do I mean by background? Think of the pre-lab your instructor gives you in lab. Background, so you understand why you're about to do what you're going to do. This is not the introduction is not about your experiment. It's about the topic. Your experiment will come up in the introduction later, but at first you are discussing what the topic is, natural selection, what sorts of things influence natural selection. You might cite your textbook. In this section, there's instructions on how to cite in the lab manual. You want to have enough information in the introduction so the reader understands your experiment. Pretend they don't know what natural selection is. You know, you have to introduce the idea. You could introduce cryptic coloration, things like that. You could also introduce Hardy-Weinberg and what it is and what it has to do with the experiment. Then you want to just briefly introduce what your experiment was, and following that, go into what your hypothesis was. So, not your null and alternative statistical hypotheses, but your research hypothesis. You know, if natural selection adapts organisms to their habitat, then da 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 da. You know, an explanation of what would happen if that hypothesis is correct. So remember, a hypothesis is an explanation. It is not a prediction. After the word if, you want to explain why you think, what you think is happening. And then after the word then, you tell the reader what you expect to see in your data if your explanation is correct. And so you could technically have two separate hypotheses here, one for the population hunted by visual predators and one for the population hunted by blind predators, or you can make it into one longer hypothesis. But when you write a hypothesis, or when you write an introduction, start broad, the big topic, and get narrow, get more specific to your experiment at the end of the introduction. So don't start talking about beans and rabbits and what you did in the lab. Start with the topic and then talk about your experiment at the very end of the introduction, followed by your hypothesis. In the materials and methods section, this is going to be a few sentences describing what you did so a researcher could replicate it, and then you'll also want to reference the lab manual there because you could tell them, hey, for full, to see where I got all this information, check out this source. In the results section, start first with the written results. By the way, each of these sections should have its own heading, kind of like this checklist does here, where it says results. You know, you'll have results in bold typically, and then your results. So start with the written results where you describe what happened in words, and then you'll cite the figure, kind of like you see here, figure 1. And so you'll want to put quantification on those results. There was a 48% increase in the red allele in this situation versus that situation, or whatever. So your first, then you'll have your figure, or in this case, figures. You're going to have 2 figures. Your first figure is going to be a scatter plot of allele frequencies over 6 generations, and that will, and it'll have 2 lines on it. One graph with 2 lines. The frequency of the red allele, or P, in the language of Hardy-Weinberg, the frequency of the red allele when hunted by visual predators versus blind predators. And you'll have your axis titles. This will not have error bars because you only did the replications once. And you'll have a brief caption where you can describe overall how much change there was from the first generation to the last generation in each case. Figure 2 will be the average number of prey eaten per generation in blind versus visual trials, and that'll have a t-test and everything else like your previous figures. And remember, this will have 2 columns on it. You're going to average the total number of rabbits eaten by blind and the total number of rabbits eaten by visual predators and compare them to see if blind predators ate more or fewer or the same amount of rabbits as visual predators. Lastly, in this section, you don't want to interpret the data. You don't want to tell us what it means. You just want to tell us what happened. So in your written results, once again, you're verbally explaining what's happening in the figures. You should include also your p-value in the written results. And don't just say p was less than 0.05. And at least in the written results, say exactly what the p-value really was. In the discussion section, this is where you bring it all together. You tell us whether or not the hypothesis was supported. You then explain your results. You don't just restate them, but you restate them while you're explaining them. So why did alleles increase or decrease? Was it selection? Was it drift? Was it flow? In these different cases, there may be a different thing causing change in the visual versus the blind predators. Why did you see the trends you saw? This is what you're trying to explain. It doesn't matter if your hypothesis was supported or not. Explain why your data did what it did. And whenever possible, don't just rely on my lab partners messed up as an explanation. Is there a logical reason for your data that you can explain? So that's what you want to do there. And so I have information here like examples. You might relate things back to Hardy-Weinberg and natural selection. Did your population evolve? How do you know? Another thing I would like to see in this section is making use then of the equation of the line in your first figure. Can you make predictions from your findings? So for example, if the trend is leading upward and the concentration of the red allele is going up, at which generation would it be 1? So you can solve that using the equation of the line. By which generation would the red allele be the only allele in the population? Maybe your data will say that will never happen, but maybe it will. So do that. See if you can figure that out. Relate your findings to what you know about evolution. Cite your manual, cite your textbook. And then if you want to get that full above and beyond credit, relate to what others have found. And I don't mean on a website or a blog, but find a scientific paper from the library and reference it and in your works. And one thing I want to point out, though, is when you reference sources like this, you never quote from them. You tell us what you found out from them in your own words and how it relates to what you figured out, and you cite that source. And then at the end, you'll have a lit cited section, which you will cite the papers that you read, the books you read, to help write this paper. And lastly, the appendix, which is just where you paste in your Excel sheet so we can double check your credit, your calculations and all that. So your discussion is going to be kind of like the opposite of your introduction. It's going to start narrow with what your experiment found out, what its hypothesis was, and then it's going to go broad and it's going to relate what you found out back to the overarching theme of natural selection. So it's going to go narrow to broad, and you can end maybe with a brief mention of what future experiments you might conduct if you were going to have a lab next week where you could design your own experiment to further your understanding. Overall, make sure your report reads like a cohesive thesis, not like you're just answering statements from a rubric like this. You know, oh, I did this, I did this, I did this. A lot of times students write these weird little sentences that don't really fit together. It's like they're answering questions. You're writing a narrative here, a thesis, and it needs to flow. Each sentence should lead to the next sentence, and it should be well polished and edited, which means you should go to the writing center if you need help with writing. Overall, this can be no longer than 3 pages. That includes the figures. Now, the appendix does not count in that 3 pages. You can add that at the end. And so that's what I'm looking for on this paper, is a well-written lab report. If you recall, if you took Bio 1 here, the Piranha paper you read, that's a good example of what a scientific paper should look like. So when I say you're writing a lab report, you're basically writing a scientific paper. Look at how scientific papers are written, how the language works, how it is written. You usually don't use I and you and we. We shouldn't see those words typically in a scientific paper. Sometimes there are exceptions there, but for Bio 2, we shouldn't see that. So don't use the word you. Don't use the word I or we typically. What you'll say is, instead of I acted like a predator on beans, you would say beans, a simulated predator was given 1 minute to eat as many beans as possible, or something like that. And so you want to word things in that third person perspective. But if you do choose to write from the I perspective, that is often allowable. Check with your individual instructor, but never say you. Never say you should see this, you can do this, you should look here. Never do that, okay? Just a pet peeve of mine. All right, so write clearly, write concisely, look at scientific literature to get a feel for how it's written. Write not as if you're trying to write to Albert Einstein and impress him, but that you're writing to another Bio 2 student, and you want them to understand what you found out. Okay? All right, good luck with everything, and I'll see you in class.